Hi, welcome to Agile Encounters. My name is Paweł Feliński, and today's topic is stakeholder management in practice. Here is what we're gonna cover. We will start with the topic of understanding stakeholders, who your stakeholders are, what are your stakeholders, how to identify them, how to understand them at all. Then a little bit more practical section, we're going to talk about mapping stakeholders to very interesting techniques, stakeholder radar and stakeholders matrix. Then we're going to move to the topic of managing stakeholders, different strategies depending on who your stakeholder is, what kind of person your stakeholder is, what you should do. And finally, very interesting practical tips for building trust while working with your stakeholders. Okay, let's start with the first topic. Whenever we talk about stakeholders in general, depending on the situation, we imagine different answers. The Scrum Guide, for instance, says indirectly, but it's quite true. Stakeholder is anybody interested in your product or service that you provide that is not part of your Scrum team. Broad definition of stakeholder would be anybody who has direct or indirect influence on your product. We can try to slice it down into more particular people. Recently, during my class, Professional Scrum Product Owner Advanced, I asked the audience question, guys, how do you know who your stakeholder is? And the answer was, well, typically we know. We simply know. When I'm a product manager, product owner, project manager, and I have my and I work with stakeholders, I start the projects, launch a product or service delivery. Typically I know who my stakeholder is. It's inherited. But let's take a look at different kinds of stakeholders over here. No-brainer, our customers are typically stakeholders, and they have direct interest in what we provide, no matter if it's a product or a service. However, very interesting is that also providers to my team, to me as a product manager, different vendors are stakeholders. They have interest in what am I doing, how we are doing it. On top of that, users, different to customers, because as a product owner or product manager, I think I am in touch with customer. I should be in touch. Not always it's possible to be in touch with users, especially if you take a look at big in-house products within corporations. We typically speak to people internally in our company and not to direct users. They are also stakeholders in that case. These three categories of stakeholders, I would say, they are external ones. People who typically, not always, are outside our organization. But within our organization, we also have stakeholders, obviously. The influencers would be those who have influence at us mainly. My manager, head of product department, CEO of the company, any people who want me to succeed with my product or service or a project. Finally, the governance, so people who I need to cooperate with while managing whatever I'm doing. Project manager could be the person, somebody from HR, somebody from legal department, maybe from sales department, different people. So stakeholders are not only the influencers, so my boss or a steering committee, not only customers, but many other people as well. The bottom line is, anybody who has direct or indirect interest in your product, and that would be the very first part. Typically, we know what our product, what stakeholders are, who our stakeholders are. So let's take a look at what kind of information we can find about them. If you attend other webinars or different training sessions, you will hear a lot about the power of brain, about the importance of the fact what is the personality of your stakeholder. You need to adjust your style of communication to the person you communicate with. And it's so funny. If you go to a conference, Agile one or not necessarily Agile one, everybody is a psychologist. No, they're not. It's not their discipline, but many people talk about psychology. We have plenty of psychology experts over there. We have also a lot of experts with PhD in neuroscience, for instance, talking about the brain human brains, or different personality types. And although I absolutely admit that these are very important topics, and I totally agree that there is something about adjusting your style of communication to particular person. So the way you communicate, you manage one stakeholder should be different to the way you manage the other stakeholder. But in my opinion, I'm not the expert in psychology. I don't want to be. This is one point of view. However, I find others way more practical, simply useful. Let's take a look at them. Power and needs. This is what I need to know about my stakeholders. What is the power behind the stakeholder? How powerful my stakeholder is? What's the level of impact on me and my product? And what are the needs of the stakeholder? Needs in a general meaning, but also needs towards me. What does he or she needs from me directly? I think if we focus on these two aspects, we'll be way more successful in communicating and eventually managing stakeholders. There are a few practices that help us deal with that. I mentioned about them already at the beginning. The very first one is stakeholder radar, and I'm starting with this one because I think it's not so popular, while it should be. It's a very nice, very gentle technique. So it's a radar, and the closer you are to the central part of the radar, the more direct communication or direct management with these stakeholders you're gonna put in that circle you need to have. A little bit away from the bullseye, you would place these stakeholders you need to be engaged with, and even far away those you need to keep involved. You need to be involved with them, and outside the radar, on the radar, but in the outer part of the radar, those that need to be aware, or you need to be aware of them. They need to be aware of what you do. That's one dimension, but there are other ones. Depending on the quadrant over here, you would put your place stakeholders that are, starting from top right corner, friendly to you and your product or service. So they're happy with what you are doing. Critics, those are people who are providing constructive feedback. They want you to succeed, but they offer the comments. They are not blindly happy about what you do. People opposed to you and your product would be those that are in conflict with you. They don't want you to succeed, and of course stakeholders that might be indifferent. So whatever. How do we work with stakeholder radar? It's pretty simple. We create avatars with some descriptions and put it on the radar. In my example, 5 different stakeholders. It's always good to write down not only name, surname of the person, but also who the person is. In this example, we have Peter, the customer. So obviously, I need to manage Peter closely as my stakeholder, and I believe my customer is pretty friendly. He wants us to succeed. I have Mary. She's a project manager and offers a lot of critics. She belongs over here. I need to be closely engaged with her, but it's not that I need to manage her directly, especially with Mary as a project manager is from my company. A little bit far from the central part of the radar is Hannah from sales. I need to keep her involved, and I need to be in touch with Nick, IT director. He's friendly, but I need to keep him aware about what we are doing. That's it. John, the CEO, has absolutely no direct interest in my product. He is on the radar, obviously, but as CEO of the company, he has way more important topics on his radar. This is one way how you can use it, stakeholder radar. A parallel technique that is worth looking at is called stakeholder matrix, or Mendelow's matrix, because that's the original name. It's not a radar anymore. It's traditional but very useful way of visualizing your stakeholders. It has two dimensions. The vertical axis is about the power of your stakeholder, influence the stakeholder has at you, and the horizontal line is about the interest, from low interest in your product or service to high one. It's not that we have four categories here only. It's a spectrum. So I believe somebody can be on the edge or between lines. We may have multiple people in one of the quadrants, also on different level of the scale. But the bottom line is that depending into which quadrant your stakeholder where your stakeholder is, in which quadrant, your approach, your strategy of addressing the stakeholder might be different. Let's start from these stakeholders who have pretty low power in terms of your product, and they're not so much interested. Here, from your side, minimal effort, really not much to do. Perhaps you need to, from time to time, send a message to them, maybe monitor what their needs are, but typically, especially if we're very, very busy, you don't need to care about these people too much. If there are people with not so much power but a lot of interest, you need to keep them informed. And not because they need the information, but because you will be very, very busy with answering their requests for information if you don't look after this quadrant. So the fact that a stakeholder has limited really low power in relation to you doesn't mean you can just skip any communication. No, keep them informed. That's very important. If you have the communication structured, so you have a process around it, then it will be very smooth and yet another tiny low-hanging task on your desk. If your stakeholder is not so much interested in what you're doing but has a lot of power, like the CEO from my previous example, keep them satisfied. These are people that typically reach out to you not so often, but when they do, they need instant answer, and they need and you need to assure that the answer is correct. Keep them satisfied. What to do exactly? Let me share a few words about it slightly later. And finally, those who have a lot of power, a lot of impact at you, and a lot of interest in your product, they have to be actively engaged. You need to work closely with them, and the majority of your duties in the field of stakeholder management will be around these people in top right quadrant, high power and high interest. How do we use the matrix? In a very, very similar way to the stakeholder radar. So we would avatars, names, or whatever you want to use, either on slide and mural board, depending on, or a physical wall, by the way, depending on what's your preference, and that's it. And you see on one clear picture who is who, as well as how to approach these stakeholders. That's it about mapping tools. I think we don't need to go into more details, but are there any conclusions based on that? Definitely there are. And although these two tools help us map my stakeholders, visualize the stakeholders, they don't necessarily tell us what exactly to do, what should be the follow-up action. In order to do that, we typically take a look at the strategies. We call it strategies or approaches to manage stakeholders. It's usually a table where we want to put way more information. Because stakeholder management, despite identifying their needs, identifying the stakeholders, identifying their needs and so on, it's all about fulfilling the needs, and the majority of your job is communication. The table over here help us plan the strategies of providing communication or managing stakeholders directly. What do we have over here? There's a column with a stakeholder name, obviously. Another column with the groups that stakeholder belongs to. If I come back to the previous slide, If it's about Peter, who's in the quadrant actively engaged, well, that's the group. That's what I would put in that column. If I know that Peter is my customer and not a governance or influencer or a provider, from the very first chart I showed today, I would add that information as well to the table. Then a column where you describe what kind of information the stakeholder needs. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Then something that it's not trying to find out the personality type of your stakeholder, not at all, but very practical. What is the preferred channel of communication with that stakeholder? Different stakeholders are different. You will find it out while having conversation with them. And finally, what are the contents that you may create or they would be interested in? Let's take a look at them. In this example, I put just 3 of our stakeholders: Peter, the customer; Mary, the project manager; and Hannah from sales. As you can see in the second column, you have first of all the quadrant from the stakeholder matrix, but also a type of the stakeholders. Peter is the customer, and the quadrant actively engaged. And I have a few hints about information that Peter needs. He's interested in forthcoming releases, the next steps, and showstoppers, because he's the customer. That's what he needs. Channels of communication: face-to-face meetings, because I realized that I asked about it, or he told me, or I simply know from observation that face-to-face is the best channel in case of Peter. What are the contents? This is tricky because you may ask, sometimes we do ask, sometimes you realize while working with that person. Case of Peter, my example is he prefers evidence but no numbers. He's not a data person, but he needs evidence, so facts, also a list of opportunities and risks, for example. Mary, the project manager, governance type of stakeholder. We need to be actively engaged with her. What kind of information does Mary need? Well, progress tracking, dependencies on other projects, and risks to address, because basically that's her job, that's the input she's interested about. She prefers weekly updates, weekly status meetings, also aggregated reports that she can share with others. She's very fact and numbers driven. She's also interested in deviations to project the KPIs. And we have Hannah from sales. She's in different quadrant, keep informed. She's an influencer, a person from my company, my organization, so internal stakeholder. She cares about customer satisfaction. That's the information she needs to know, but also potential use of the product with other customers. She prefers calls. There's no sense to send email to hers, and the contents are stories. If you're a storyteller, you're good in telling stories. That's what works with her. This is just an example, obviously, and I encourage you all not to create it for all stakeholders that you have in your matrix. Perhaps the most important ones, so those in actively engaged and keep informed sections, as an example. Depending on how many you have. In my practice, it's anything between 2 and 40 people, really. But there's no sense to keep on your radar 40 people, because you will not be able to manage all of them actively. About that, by the way, one more note at the very end of our meeting today. Let's move on. So these were the strategies for what to do with my stakeholders. But there's one important topic before we go or reach out to stakeholders. It would be awesome if we are able to build trust while working with them. And trust in business relationships, trust in organizations, or trust among people, it's a broad topic that I don't want to cover fully over here. I think if you are interested in that topic, everything that could have been written was written by Dale Carnegie. in a bestseller, a very old one, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Good one, and I'm not going into the details here as well. But trust is very important. Trust is very important, and without trust, many of your stakeholders may start to move from friendly area, friendly zone to the zone that we name critics, and then those who are opposed. That's not what we want to have. So I'd like to share with you a few practical tips on building trust that I didn't read in the book, not at all, but something that worked for me and for us at Meyrick during recent engagements. So first of all, the most important trust builder, and you would read about it in Dale Carnegie's book actually, is to listen. It's to be a listener. So not to talk a lot, but to listen. Listen to the needs of the person. Listen to the language, communication style of your stakeholder. Treat each of your stakeholders individually, even if you have them in one room. These are completely different. Could be completely different people, and they deserve your attention. That's the first thing. And I think it's a no-brainer, right? However, a few years ago, I remember we had a lot of fun with one of stakeholders of a project that we supported. That's why I put an asterisk over here. The problem was that person, in comparison to others, was very. I'm gonna talk about personality type again. While I shouldn't, was very straightforward, straight to the point. Give me data, facts, no stories, no small talk at all. That's interesting because that person, whenever I gave space, I give her space. Whenever I wanted her to talk about her needs and what she needs, she said she claimed that I'm not proactive enough. She thought I should be the one talking. I should be the one actually doing a lot, because if I'm not, I'm stepping back. Interesting case. So although I treat the rule of listen to your stakeholders as a very important rule, please mind it's not that you just have to sit down and say nothing. There are people who actually want you to contribute way more. As a hint, of course. Next one way more interesting, in my opinion, is a special attitude that I discussed about it during many training sessions. It's very hard to teach it. It's the attitude that I called "How can I help?" How can I help you, my stakeholder? So starting, continuing, finishing each meeting with the stakeholder with that attitude, I am here for you. I want to know how I can help you, not what you can do for me, although this is part of stakeholders management, asking them to do something, but actually I'm representing, I am in the stance, and I am showing my stakeholder, and that's not a joke, I can't be lying about it at all. I want to represent or think in terms of my stakeholder interests. Of course, I have multiple stakeholders. So if I collect the needs of all of them, perhaps I won't be able to satisfy all of them. Perhaps I don't want to satisfy the needs of all stakeholders. But that attitude builds trust, especially early in the cooperation with your stakeholder. And it's worth investing some time. And what I called the curiosity, if you use your internal curiosity, childish even curiosity, as if you were a child, typically stakeholders open up and tell you way more. That's one thing. Another set of tips, final tips I have for you today, are two powerful questions that over last several years we found out very useful. The very first one sounds like a no-brainer, but ask yourself, how often do you ask your stakeholders these questions? What's your purpose? A very broad, open-ended question about the purpose of a stakeholder in the context of the product or the service. Not what's your target, what's your goal, but what's your general purpose. Sometimes I think we are finishing the meeting, and whenever I ask, this kind of question we continue for over half an hour. That's a wonderful question to find out what's the vision of your stakeholder or multiple stakeholders if you have them in a bigger meeting. And finally, a question that I enjoy and love the most. What's your personal goal? So please mind it, what's your purpose is a question, what's your purpose in general about my product or service? But very often a stakeholder has personal goal. For instance, as a stakeholder, I want to be promoted, or that the success of your product is actually part of my incentive plan or my KPIs as a stakeholder. So it's very important if you first of all ask your stakeholder about his or her personal goal, personal investment in whatever you're doing, because first of all it builds trust, but also gives you very important information about what is really important, how you can manage your service or product delivery in the future. That's it for today. We covered a lot, except for one topic, and the topic is if I have many stakeholders, what should I do with them? If I can't be in meetings with stakeholders one by one, and it can't my calendar cannot be full of this kind of meetings. I have other stuff to do. There are techniques that help us manage multiple stakeholders at once. So collaborative exercises, I would say activities with stakeholders. And about that, we're going to talk during the next Agile Encounter. Stay tuned, visit us on our YouTube channel or on our website. March 15, what to do to manage multiple stakeholders. That would be the second part of our journey into stakeholder management. Thank you very much. Have a good day.